and and as you said, we can be really informal, and that's the nice thing about these more intimate groups. I love it because everybody can sort of chat. And I'll just kick off with a question. Um, while folks have time to think about what they'd like to ask Cheniqua today, but I usually ask like someone your age. I'll say, "Oh, what's your advice to other young women?" So that's one part of my question. But the other part of my question is, what's your advice to women my age or older women about what they can do to better support younger women in leadership?
Yeah, I think one thing that I really reflected on is like because I grew up having a father who was like 80, like and I had a mom who was like in her 40s. And so I had the experience of both like learning how to communicate with both, both like the, retiring generation as well so as like the generation that was coming up just before me, like I think on the cusp of millennials, but okay, what does that mean? And I think that like sometimes there's a breakdown in communication cross generation. And so people will leave their roles after serving 20, 30 years. And that knowledge and that wisdom, my predecessor, for example, at the St. Paul, Minnesota Foundation had been here for 30 years. Health partners, she knew like so many different health people and health spaces and like, and just had gathered just this robust portfolio of work. And upon her exiting, like I was like, I really want to talk to her. I want to, have that conversation with her to learn from her. So that way I can, hear the things that she may have tried in the past or like learn about the history. And that would be kind of like my encouragement for like young people is to occupy that space of like learning about what came before you. And at the same time for like the older generation of people who are older than me. So 27, like not old, but older than me. Be willing to share that and be intentional about doing so. Like what happens to these spaces, not only positions, but stories, when we don't share them, we lose them. And I think that that's been like a huge part of my identity is like learning more about my family. My dad was big at telling me stories about where we came from because he really wanted me to know, like, I grew up in Worthington. This is what I'm seeing, but that's not where my family originates from, right? Like my mom is from Memphis, Tennessee. My dad is from Kansas, like Kansas City, Kansas. His journey and time as a Black man and a Black Native man at that in the 60s and 50s was different than mine. All of these things and stories translate into work too, because it's just really work, jobs, fun, whatever, especially for people who are like learning still about this role. They have a lot of, young people have a lot of knowledge. We do know a lot of things. We'll bring this new space of like text, but like the technology space to you. We may be more tech savvy. And yet still, we still want to learn more and hear more about your story, the things that you guys have experienced. And I feel like that conversation doesn't happen enough. Maybe there's other things that prevent that, but that would be like the one. It'd be like that communication space of valuing other people's experience, but also being willing to share what you've had to learn and go through. Because some of the most fascinating conversations to me are the people who've been at the foundation for 15 years and can tell me, one, how many name changes we've had, all of the things down to like, when I came in, not necessarily knowing much about philanthropy, but knowing a lot more than most of my colleagues about government and understanding the state legislature, which I didn't know would be beneficial in this space, but like jumping into civic engagement as a portfolio space for me. I've actually educated some of my peers on some of the work that some of these organizations do across the state. And at the same time in the health sphere, like talking to a woman who had maneuvered health, MNsure, healthcare, dental care, or had worked with different clinics across the state for the last 3 decades was beneficial. And something that could not be replaced with, reading a handbook.
I love it. If folks have questions, pop in, or of course, I have another one. You mentioned that you ran for office right out of college. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what that was like?
Yeah. So I ran for state representative in Southwest Minnesota, and at the time it was 22B. It's not 22B anymore, redistricting. But for reference, Representative Hamilton, who's retiring. He still represents that area. And so I ran at the time, I think one ran as a Democrat, was the youngest DFL endorsed candidate at the time on the ballot. 22 turning 23. When I filed, I was 22. When the election ended, I was 23. And for the young people on the phone, like on the call, if you're at all thinking about like political office, feel free to talk to me. I genuinely am a huge like cheerleader for it. I think it was a really great decision, and not only for me, but for my community. And so like at the same time in Worthington, I think one of the no matter where, we are a community that is like 42% people, like, you know, young youth of color. Their schools have so many diverse students, like from different backgrounds. So many different languages are spoken in the community. I genuinely feel strongly that there should be more diversity and representation. And that could be more women in office. That could be like, we genuinely we're still needing to get more women in office in general. Like it doesn't race, black, brown, purple. It's like Democrat, Republican, like more women need to be in office. It's still a very, very strong like thing for me. And so running in Worthington and Wyndham and Jackson and Redwood County, going over to Walnut Grove and Sanborn, really just in many ways was a very fun experience. And so, and also like the other thing that people don't really talk about is like, it's hard. You're very public facing. People have a lot of questions and like kind of similar to this there, but they are a little bit more different when you're knocking on the door. They're like, okay, so here's all my questions now, or they hear that you're running, so they call you, they want to talk about it. But I was very, what I think I will take with me forever is like, there were people who I had never met, who became some of my closest friends during this process, like traveled miles, literally getting in their cars, driving 50 miles up the street with me just to door knock and just to talk about why they thought I'd be a great state representative. And in the volunteers and the people that really do make the campaigns and really do help with the elections, the passion that they have for you is like is the boost that you need to kind of tackle all the things that are going on. A lot of people didn't know that I had a full-time job during the time I was running for state rep. So some days I'd literally get up and go to Minneapolis, because that was the time that I worked for Keith Ellison. Would literally go to make it for like a morning meeting, then to come back and door knock in the evening. So like that's a 3-hour commute both ways, 6 hours in the car. But those 6 hours were genuinely like, you know, so worth it to me, because I was running in Worthington, I was working in the cities, and while my boss was like helping me and like maneuvering that space and understood that I was running for office, it can still be challenging with people, even just everyday people running for office too, where it's like they're not doing 6 hours traveling, but they're still working full time. And in rural Minnesota in particular, that's the case. Like nobody is running, this is their job, like they're running for office. Like I've never met a candidate so far who's like, oh yeah, I took the time off to run for office. Almost all the candidates that were running in Southwest Minnesota at the time were working full time. They were like managing, you know, some of them had kids, they were managing like their families. And I think that that's something where I'm just like, I got to see the human in running, and I got to see all of the people power that is behind campaigns. And yeah, you know, you have a little spice in the debate. We're different people, we're different values, we're different spaces, and we represent different parties. And at the same time, like getting a chance to talk to so many different people, whether they agreed with me holistically or not, or just to challenge what people thought a Democratic candidate believed, or what a Republican candidate believed, and just being like, I'm running for office because I genuinely want to make a change, and I genuinely want to build power in our community. And then see afterwards things like the school referendum pass in our community because people knew how to campaign organize. See 2 women of color run for office after me that worked on my campaign pretty much every day. Things like that. While I don't take credit for their decision to do so, I definitely think that sometimes it takes one person to say, hey, I can do this, for several other people to follow afterwards. And that's why I ran. And so like, it didn't matter. I was like, this is just cool. Like, this is great. Like, if, you know, yes, you run to win, or, you know, you run in a space where you're like, I genuinely want to be this political office. Like I want to hold the state representative seat. But also a huge part of our campaign from the beginning was like, we want to make it so other people know that it's possible. And so when students were talking about this in high school and like being like, who is this? What is this person? Like when they would be like, I am so glad you're doing this. When kids would come up to me and be like, I can see myself in you. It made my day. And it was like part of the reason why I think like it's the humanity in politics that I think sometimes gets lost in whatever we see on media. It just doesn't capture it very well. But, you know, just coming into that space, I think that's what I think of political office. And that's what I think of campaigning. And it was really something that I will take with me for the rest of my life.
Okay, folks, feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions. I have many, of course, so, but I know that other people do too. Caitlin, you just unmuted. What do you have?
Yes, I have a question. So I actually, one of my minors is political science, and I initially just added it on because I just thought politics were interesting. And just because you hear about so many different things through media and some things get misconstrued, I wanted to actually understand politics better. And it was kind of something like I never even wanted to consider going into politics. It was just something that to me at the time sounded like a giant headache. But as I've gotten older and gotten more involved in like learning more about politics and like the impacts that I could make, even just as a young person, let alone a young woman, I was just kind of curious as to what that all looked like for you. Like initially, I know you said that you weren't really sure either if you could see yourself entering into politics, but like what was it for you that really kind of made you start going off into that direction? And where would you say like or like what would be some advice you'd have for somebody who's kind of looking into possibly entering into that?
Yeah, so honestly, I would say I started to be in the spaces, like the more political spaces, and would hear a lot of the conversation. And so many times, and yeah, so many times at the University of Minnesota, or even just like in general, like in the political sphere, I was the voice that would be like, yeah, so growing up in Worthington, that wasn't my experience. Or like growing up in Worthington, like there would be more times where I would be kind of like either the only rural voice or the only Black woman in the room. And whether that was like, and that wasn't, it was like, at that point in time, I wasn't necessarily thinking about value-based like decisions on party or partisanship. It was like really genuinely, it was like sometimes the voice at the table was missing and it was mine, or like my family's, or my friends, where I could see that so many decisions started to happen without us. And I wanted to change that. And I think like in so many different spaces as I continue to get invited to discussions and luncheons, and it was at the Humphrey School. So, you know, like discussions with the senator, or like influencing, talking to them about what young students wanted. I joined the undergraduate student advisory board to represent my college. In there, you know, like learning more about like how these decisions such as tuition or like housing arrangements, or whether a building is remodeled, I didn't know really all the things that went into that. I had never, you know, met the president of the U until I was on that board. And so some of the conversations that I had, I just started to learn that a lot of decisions were made and the room didn't look like the way I necessarily wanted it to. And I think the solution in that space was to kind of be the solution and bring other people with me. And so that really shaped how the opportunities I took, the internships, people I chose to work with. I don't think I've ever worked for an elected official that I genuinely didn't like. And there's value in that, because sometimes people will go off of the, oh, it's a fancy title, like it's a nice work, you know, but for me, it's a lot more than that. I think because I get a chance to learn more about the person. I'm not joining a campaign to door knock for someone if I don't know that they're going to be, because I think your word means something, you know, like if I'm telling, I see Andy here, if I'm telling Andy, like, you should talk to this person, I want to know them. And if I don't know them, it's kind of like a deal breaker for me. So I also think that in the space of political science and just your curiosity in the space of learning more about politics, like lean into that, but also know that you can define what that looks like for you, and who you work with and what you do, like what issues you align yourself with, that's all to your discretion. And so like that part of it has been really fun, because I don't do everything a certain way. I don't have a political science degree. I have a family social science degree, which has helped me to occupy the political science degree space. And then the one thing I will say is, even if you don't have a verse in politics, you can still enter it. Like I literally wish that people who were like everyday people would join politics. Like a teacher, run. If a like athlete, like great, you're running. If a like I genuinely am just like, so we need a diversity in profession in government. We need more women in government, but also like in general, like in that space. So often I think people think that they need a certain degree or a certain job title, and you do not. You don't. You don't. And if someone tells you do, tell them ask them what their degree is, and listen. Because I genuinely, there's no job description. I've never seen a job description for any political office, ever. Even the job description when you file for office is very lenient. You have to live in the city, like live in the space. You have to be eligible to vote, and that's it, and pay the fee. There's no like, here's what we expect, here's the expectations. And I think that is like the number one thing I learned from all the spaces that I've occupied is people come from all walks of life. And so just know that going in is like, this could be the space and the things that you learn. It doesn't necessarily have to define how you lead. And it also can change person to person. Like whoever you talk to could come from a completely different space.
That's such a good point, Cheniqua, too, that, I mean, we have a citizen legislature. It's really a good way to think about that. And everybody, we want a very representative, public policy. So it's great. That's a really great way to lift that up. Who else has a question? Feel free to unmute. Oh, Teresa.
I will go ahead. Hello, Cheniqua. Hello, Teresa. And Teresa, I love your background. I don't know if that's really your window or just a lovely screensaver you have. It's beautiful. My question is, I've been to so many political functions in all my life, but I will just say in the last year, and there aren't enough people who don't have gray hair, I'll just say, especially in southern Minnesota. And yet I see young people involved in politics, but what are some of the barriers? Is it party rules? Because there are some complex, daunting rules and procedures within probably both political parties. I affiliate with one, but I suspect it's comparable in the other party. How can we make involvement politically more accessible to younger people? What can I do to make that more possible? I guess it's kind of like Teresa's question, how can we help more people rise into leadership? But
so two quick questions for the audience. If you're under 30, how many of you guys like to go to meetings that are 4 hours long? Okay. Other question, how many of you guys like to go to the room where you're the only person under 30? Anyone? Okay. And I say this, Teresa, I say this to like, so many people ask me this question too. Like, so I'm the outreach and inclusion officer for the Democratic Party. So I travel across the state. I talk to so many different caucuses, conventions, Senate districts, organizing units. It's kind of like the same. And yes, both like parties have this structure, the Roberts Rule of Order, like we follow kind of in that same space. There's probably a lot of similarities, probably more than we care to admit. But in that space where we're coming to that, those are the two things that I hear most of the time when I talk to young people. All the meetings that everyone does. I'm just like, I know, but this is where the business happens. They're like, I know, Cheniqua, but I'm not sitting through like 4 hours, 3 hours of this. And I'm like, I know. And so it's really maneuvering some of those spaces of like being conscious of the time that we ask. And so one thing I'm encouraging people to think about is take a scope of the people who you are seeing, like the organizers you're seeing, the young people that you're seeing out and about, and start to pull them in slowly, like bring us in for the time that can maximize. Maybe we are there to lead discussions, or maybe there's something happening that results around what we're doing. And I don't speak on behalf of all of the young people, but that's why I asked the question for some of the folks on the call. Is this so much of coming back, or really feeling like it might be the space, just like everyone else, where we may not be, some of us may not be parents, some of us may not have those things going on, as well as like some of the other like adults in the room. And so most of us have more than one thing, more than one job. Maybe we're the caregivers to our family, which for me was a large part of my high school space. I was maneuvering work, school, all the extracurriculars that I had. And I had a brother with disabilities whom I helped my mother take care of when my dad started to age and have Alzheimer's. And so like my space, if you invited me to sit through a 2 or 3 hour meeting, there were several people I had to check with before I could even get there. And I think that that's true for a lot of people, but it's like sometimes for young people, I think it's necessarily like, I think we're a little better at like not stretching ourselves that thin, where I think a lot of people sometimes have had no choice. And young people are like, yeah, no, I'm not doing that. I think that there's a space and opportunity to talk with folks to see what they care about, but I really be strategic of where you invite them, and make sure to invite more than one person. It's really, really intimidating, myself included. And as extroverted as I am, it is intimidating to walk into a room, even now, where I have a title that'll legitimize why I'm there, where someone will be like, so Cheniqua, how do young people think? And I'm just like, I don't know. I don't know how they think. I know what I'm thinking. And I think that there's sometimes like just, even if it's two, right? Like even if it's two people, like for a fact, two people are coming and that you've really worked on trying to outreach to and bring. And and then you're intentional, right? Like we're putting them together, we're gonna bring together this group, and holding that conversation can make all the difference. When I walked on here and I can see like, I knew Teresa, so I feel comfortable in this conversation. And then Emma popped on, and then, it's like, and then Caitlin popped on, and I was like, oh, okay, like this is gonna be a fun conversation. And so those things are just super important, Teresa. And I think that that's something that in our community, like especially in Southwest Minnesota, like in Worthington, all of those things are possible. And just with that space of mindfulness that like, it's hard to do things by yourself when you don't know a lot of people. And you really just have to, if there's a way to minimize the meeting times, or even just to bring us in for 15 minutes, just to show us a little bit of things, or even just to like, hey, do you have time for like, it's 4 hours, but could you commit to one? That's a different ask than could you give up your whole Saturday morning to participate in the conversation, which would, for most people, it's like, yeah, this is where decisions are made. This is the time that's necessary. I was at a state convention last week, all day Saturday, all day Sunday. And I was there because I had to be there, but whew, that's hard. It's hard. It's very hard to sit through 48 hours of like intense, because I'm not, it's like that's other space too. Like I'm not conflict aversion, but like sometimes those things can get very heated and people are very passionate. And I'm just like, yeah, I can give you an hour.
Helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I love it. And Teresa, that is my background in about a week when my purple flowers bloom. I had to put them up. I needed flowers this morning. So I'm also going to pop in the chat here, just speaking about meetings too, just to pitch Teresa Kevney a little bit too, the DFL Rural Caucus, and Teresa's the chair of that, and all of a sudden there's an agenda and those meetings like boom, boom, boom. So that's a really good example of how you can lead a group and keep that agenda tight. And so I just threw that in there just sort of FYI of some of the cool work that Teresa's doing in rural Minnesota. Who else? We only have time for a couple more questions. What else? Anybody else have anything that you'd like to ask Cheniqua? Yeah, Andy, go ahead.
Yeah. So Cheniqua, I'm so inspired. Thank you. That's so great. And I'm curious, kind of in the organizing that you're doing, sort of the mobilizing all of that. I'd love to hear sort of things that give you hope kind of visions that you see action on, that you feel like, oh, this is possible, there's movement, you know? Yeah, just some kind of things that kind of get you really, really jazzed as you see they're moving forward.
Yeah, so I can tell you what doesn't. No, I'm kidding. I don't watch TV like that. But I really don't. I really don't spend as much time on TV, and I'm also like trying to minimize some of my social media exposure. But like I think genuinely, I try to talk to groups like you, but also like, like I spend a lot of time in the schools too. And some of our kids they give me so much joy. In part because I know that growing up, I would not be where I am right now without my family, without my mentors, without like advisors. And the many times like I can think of like in Worthington, like I've never been a morning person. So those 7 a.m., 6 a.m. bus rides, there were more, I probably like went just as the bus was leaving so many times in high school that I don't care to admit it. But like I know what that's, it's like, it's not that far. It's like not that far away. Like I'm 26, so like less than a decade ago, it was like in the halls. But just going back and hearing all the things that they know and that they're watching and they're informed about. And I think sometimes we may not want to like address those things, but our kids are like, what? They're being heavily affected by everything that's going on. And so as much as I can, mitigate that, whether we play like basketball or like we go, I have a youth group of women that I bring together, and we literally do vision boards. And like, I never used to plan out things, but it's been really helpful to see. And those spaces for me give me a lot of hope, because I'm in awe sometimes about the conversations that I'm having. I'm like, I just met with a bunch of 14-year-olds and we talked about like, and what they knew about, we talked about mental health and self-care and goals and visions. And I'm like, when I was 14, I wasn't talking about that. I was like working at Hy-Vee and genuinely wanted to be left alone. I was like, I don't know. So some of these things where some of our young kids are like, they're so far ahead. One of my partner's niece he's from Ghana, and his niece is like 3. And we sat and we did like flags of the country. She knows the different flags from respective countries. We were watching YouTube videos and basically being like, what flag is that? And she's like, oh, Russia, Tanzania. I was like, well, how do you know that's your child? You're 3 years old. So I just would say like, don't forget some of the young kids that we have in our communities, and we all have. Like, I know childcare is often talked about as an issue, but just in general, like our kids and their minds, their innocence, but also their wisdom right now is, I think, some of the highest I've seen. And so like for myself, like and that's just my space of hope and breath of fresh air. And often when I talk to adults, sometimes it's crazy. Sometimes like talking to kids is more fun than talking to a group of adults, because we have our ideas and things formed and thoughts. And I argue less with kids. I debate less with kids. So that would be what I would say right now. Our kids are watching us, but like they're also very, very in tune to who they are and like what their goals are too.
I love it. And Andy, that was a great question, I think, to close with. But Cheniqua, before we close, is there anything else you'd like to share as we sort of start to wrap this up?
I just want to like say, like, I am very excited about the work that you're doing, Teresa, as well. So as like these spaces and like community spaces, I've worked really, for like the last few years, worked really hard to continue to have meetings like this. And so while these are like really cool as well, I hope people may know each other or reach out. I'll put my email as well in the chat. But if there's anything like you guys are thinking of, maybe it's like doing stuff in Worthington, or like you want to hear more about me, or you want to talk about grants, like I'm an open book and I always welcome the conversation. So like, feel free to reach out, especially if this is our first time meeting. And like, I know, Emma, you're in Chicago now, and like there's different spaces. but it's great to see you guys, and honestly, just really thankful to have the conversation, and thanks for listening. Diana, it's good to see you too. I know you're off camera too, but I just congratulate you on all the things that you've been able to accomplish too. Teresa is likewise. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Cheniqua. And for those of you that hadn't met Cheniqua before, now you'll understand why I definitely wanted to have Cheniqua be one of our leading women. So thank you so much. And we're going to keep these going. We've had great feedback on these sessions. And as I said at the beginning, I learned so much, and I just am very grateful for you taking time to do this with us today, Cheniqua. And just a little bit about 100 Row Women. We've got some fun stuff going on. One thing is we're doing yoga, online yoga at noon on Mondays. It's 8 o'clock in the morning on Tuesdays. And it's incredible. I mean, last week she did a thing where we just focused on her feet. It was like the best. So it's not like traditional yoga. So I would just, and it's all free. Please join us. Emma's throwing some stuff in the chat there. We also have a virtual book group. And Giver of Stars is our book this month. We do fiction one month, nonfiction the next. People come in and out depending on the book. You don't have to have read the book to join either. It's just like, come get together. So those are just a couple fun things that we're doing this summer, and we'll continue doing Ask a Leading Woman. Our next Ask a Leading Woman, and the date has shifted a little bit because of session, but Julie Rosen, Senator Rosen from Fairmont, is going to be our next Ask a Leading Woman, and she is retiring after a long career in the legislature. So we're just still trying to nail that down. I think it's going to be the 10th, but all depends on if the governor calls folks back in. So we're waiting to hear on that. And we have a webinar June 8th with social innovators from the Initiative Foundation. So stay tuned for that. But other than that, that's sort of my commercials for what's going on with 100 Row Women. But again, thank you so much, Cheniqua, and thanks everybody for joining today. And yeah, take Cheniqua up on her offer, follow up with her. So everybody have a great rest of your day, and thanks again for joining.